Hello and welcome to another video on research methods revision. These are the areas highlighted that you guys wanted to go over, and this week we are going over validity and reliability, what these two terms mean, the different types of validity in particular, and methods that we use to measure or to assure that we have validity or reliability. So get your pens at the ready, get ready to note down some of these key terms and make sure that you have definitions of them and make sure you know how to use them in context. Okay, so in its most basic sense, what is the difference between reliability and validity? Well, reliability is similar to consistency. So it's about achieving the same or similar results every time you do something. So if you consider a ruler, for example, if you measure the length of something today, like your pen, and you repeat it again next week, you would expect to get the same result because the ruler is a consistent measure of length. So we would say it's a reliable measure. It consistently reproduces the same results. In psychology, we want to know the same about the tests that we use. Are they consistent in measurement? And if not, that is a problem for us. So reliability is a key concept, and certainly one that you can use to question research. The other key term that you need is validity. Validity is often regarded as accuracy for the purpose of a definition. A test is valid if it measures what it claims to measure. Now, throughout the course, we have questioned the validity of different tests, different studies, and we will go into more detail about the different types of validity in a second. But as a general rule, if we believe that the research is measuring what it claims to measure, then we would consider it valid. So, for example, a test of intelligence should measure intelligence and not measure something else, such as memory. There is a distinction between internal and external validity, and I will go over that again in a bit. So reliability, as we've said, is about producing consistent results. Now, a test can be reliable but not valid. By that I mean it can consistently produce the wrong result. I could, for instance, be throwing darts at a dartboard at the treble 20 and consistently hit the 1. That doesn't make me a good darts player, it makes me a consistently bad one. Likewise, with a test, we could consistently be measuring the wrong thing. For instance, we could be measuring, or we could be consistently getting incorrect results. So a test can be reliable but not valid. Now the question mark is, can you have validity if you don't have reliability? Now obviously the first time you do a test, you don't know if it's reliable or not because you haven't got any measurements to decide whether it's consistent. But if you do create a test and you keep getting different results, it's unreliable, and therefore we would say it cannot be valid. So reliability really is a key cornerstone of good research. When it comes to assessing the reliability of a study or a test that we're doing, there are three simple ways. Concepts that you need to know. The first is test retest. This is the most common, and this is the one that we generally talk about. If you do a study and you repeat it and get similar results, then we can establish some form of reliability. So that's doing the same test on two separate occasions. And often, if a piece of research is replicated and it fails to achieve the same results, then that is a problem for that test. Now, the test retest method can be quite slow because you often have to wait a while before you can test again. A quicker way of doing it, particularly if you're doing something like an IQ test or something involving like a questionnaire or something, is called the split half method, where you take your test and you divide it in half, um, and you test the first half against the second half. So, for example, you give a load of participants an IQ test. They sit the first half of the test and the second half, and if the first half of the test's results are similar to the second half, then we can say that there's reliability throughout the test. If they score massively different on the two halves, then you've got to question what the test is actually doing. The final key term to do with reliability often occurs in observational research, which is inter-rater reliability. When you've got two people rating the same behavior, then are they rating it in a consistent way? You know, if you're looking at, say, aggressive behavior in children, if one researcher says, oh, look, those kids are being really aggressive, but the other one went, it's just a bit of rough and tumble play, that's not aggression, that's fun. Then that needs to be established, and that's called inter-rater reliability. And it's also important to establish it to avoid bias, which can affect the validity. So we're going to move on now, and we'll talk briefly about validity. So first up, internal validity. Now, basically, this is the point of, does the test do what it claims to do? Or to put it in its correct form, are the effects of a study down to the manipulation of the independent variable and not some other factor? For example, an extraneous variable. So there are 5 key ways in which we can improve the internal validity of a study. Number 1 is to identify and control extraneous variables that may well affect our dependent variable in our study. So obviously in a normal experiment, you change the independent variable and you measure the dependent variable. As long as everything else stays the same, any change in the dependent variable must be down to whatever you did to the independent variable. Unless, of course, you do not keep everything the same. And that's what we mean by control. So first and foremost, controlling variables. Another way in which we can improve internal validity is to use standardized procedures. That includes standardized instructions. And this is to make sure that you don't tell, if you've got 2 groups, a control group and an experimental group, you don't tell them different things. They've got to receive the same instructions and go through the same procedures. Otherwise, any difference there could be the confounding variable. That could be the thing that's changing the DV, not whatever your independent variable is. If you're using repeated measures, which we talked about last week in research design, then counterbalancing is a way of improving the internal validity. And this makes sure that order effects, which appear in repeated measures, don't become a confounding variable. Again, this is all about, is my test measuring what I think I'm doing? Is it, what it claims to be? Counterbalancing is one way to do that. Another way to deal with it is to deal with demand characteristics. So if your participants cotton on to what the research is about, they may change their behavior to suit what they believe you want, or alternatively, they might try and screw it up. One way to deal with this is to use the single blind, which is a nice way of saying you lie to them about what the research is about. Now, that doesn't necessarily get rid of all demand characteristics. For instance, if you think about Ash's line study, he used a single blind. He said it was about perception of length. That was a lie to ensure that there was fewer demand characteristics. But we still suspect that, given the setup in Ash's study, that some people were responding to the demand characteristics. They may not have fallen for that lie, or on some level they may have thought, nah, there's something fishy about this. So even when using the single blind, you can still have demand characteristics, but they should be reduced. And the final thing to consider with internal validity is the investigator effect. So you as a researcher Do you consciously or unconsciously act in a way that will bring about the results that you want? Now, one way to get around this is to use the double blind, which is where the participants are lied to, and also the researcher who is conducting the test doesn't know what the point of it is. They're not aware of the aims. So you employ somebody else to do the research for you, and you don't tell them what it is about. You just provide them with the standardized procedures. So the double blind is a way of improving internal validity. So these 5 things here are important ways to improve the internal validity of a study. Equally, if these are not used in a study, we can use it to critique the study and say, oh, we can question the internal validity. External validity is when we ask, can the results from this study be generalized outside of the particular research setting in which they were obtained? Or to put it another way, how much do they tell us about real life? Now, external validity is going to be a bountiful source of evaluation for you if you use it correctly. A lot of students just bung in or some external validity criticism without really explaining what it means, and they don't get credit for it. So I'll explain a little bit about how to do that in a sec. But basically, there are 3 main types of external validity, which refer to place, the people, and the time. You're aware of these from when we did this in lesson, hopefully. The first is ecological validity, which is, can we then generalize this to another setting? This is a particular problem when you're using artificial lab conditions. So, for instance, Peterson and Peterson's study of the duration of short-term memory. Brilliantly controlled lab experiment. We can applaud it for its reliability. We can applaud it for its internal validity because it's well controlled. However, is it realistic to how short-term memory works in other settings outside of the lab? How often, for instance, do we, under controlled conditions, count backwards from a large number in 3s whilst trying to remember 3 nonsense consonants? It's never happened to me outside of that setting. So in that sense, the place, if you've done it in a lab, can we then say, oh, this is exactly how it works in real life? If we can't, we can question the ecological validity. Now, when I was just explaining about Peterson and Peterson there, I was using it to evaluate it. So I was saying specifically the task. I didn't just say, oh, Peterson and Peterson lack ecological validity. I was saying they lack ecological validity because the task was highly artificial. Explain what the task is. Does it represent memory in real life? For instance, you could also say Milgram's study of obedience. I wouldn't say, oh, Milgram lacks ecological validity because it was an artificial situation. I would say, what is it about that situation that Milgram created that was artificial, and why can we then not apply that to why people obey the police, or why students obey teachers, or any of the other forms of obedience in everyday life? Secondly is the people, population validity. Can the results of your study be generalized to other people? This is more likely to be a sampling issue than anything else. So for instance, Ash, as we will all remember, used males in his study of conformity. Now, is this an issue? Can we apply or generalize these results to women? If we can't, then, or if we suspect we can't, then we can question the population validity of the study. Equally, Moscovici only used females. And finally, the temporal validity, which is about time. When did it happen? Again, to use your evaluation correctly, you have to say, identify what the issue was with the time that it was done and why social conditions might have changed. Again, a classic example, Ash. Done in the 1950s, you can argue that America in the 1950s, post-war, was a much more conformist time where people tended to work more together. There was a massive fear of communism, so people were like, "Oh, you got to be American, you got to do this, you got to do that." So they were much more uh, less individualistic. Nowadays, we can argue the social conditions have changed, and individualism is considered more of a good thing. So, in that respect, we could argue Ash's study wouldn't work now or isn't as applicable now. Okay, when it comes to assessing the validity of a study, there are various ways that you can use to measure, if you like, the validity of a study. Now, this is new. We didn't cover this in lesson. I was intending to cover it again when we went over research methods. And this is it. We're going to do it now. There's four terms or four ways in which you can assess the validity of a study. And we'll quickly go through them. Number one is the face validity. Right, face validity means on the face of it, does the test do what it says it does? So, if for instance you've created a questionnaire about depression and you have a question on there saying, do you feel suicidal? On the face of it, that has validity, right? You'd say, yes, that's a valid question to ask of someone who might have depression. It is the simplest measure and it is also the least accurate because sometimes the face validity or measuring face validity on this sort of level throws up some sort of problems. So, for instance, you might have a questionnaire that has a question about depression that says, do you believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ? And you'd say, well, on face validity, nonsense. There's no validity to that question. It's got nothing to do with depression. However, if that questionnaire, and this is a real life example, by the way, if that questionnaire was given to a highly religious Christian group and they said, no, I don't believe in the second coming of Jesus, then you could argue, well, you should. That's part of your religion or what you claim. And therefore it could be argued that that's a measure of depression because you're no longer believing what you used to believe. So face validity is a bit of a crude measure. On the face of it, does it look like it makes sense? Another way of assessing the validity is using meta-analyses. So you might remember this, things like Van Eichendorn and Kronenberg's study of cross-cultural variations in attachment was a meta-analysis where you take the results of lots and lots of different studies. Now, this is kind of using reliability to check the validity of something. Remember, we can't really claim something is valid if it doesn't have reliability. So if meta-analyses that maybe are using different studies, well, almost certainly are using different studies that might be used in different parts of the world and might be used with different groups of people, if they're throwing out different results, then that asks questions about culture, about population validity, and we can start to question the validity. However, if a meta-analysis is showing massive similarities in the results that we're achieving, we can sort of say or praise the validity of a study. When you're dealing with a test, another way of doing it is to use concurrent validity. So, for instance, if you create concurrent means alongside something that currently exists. So, for instance, if you were creating a new IQ test, a new measurement of intelligence, you might use an existing IQ test that we know is valid on somebody, and then the new test. And if the new test gets similar results to the existing test, then we can say our new test has validity. So concurrent validity is whenever you're creating a new study or a new test, does it measure things in a similar way to already existing and already things that are considered valid? I'm not making any sense here, am I? And finally, number 4, predictive validity. Again, back on the IQ test example, predictive validity is, does our test predict future performance on something? So, for instance, if it was an IQ test and you score high on it, we should be able to predict that you will do well in exams or at university or something like that. If you give people an IQ test and then years down the line, none of it seems to have any bearing on how they do in later life, then we can say, well, actually, it wasn't valid. So these four methods are ways that we can, if you like, assess or test the validity of research. And I would like you to add these with definitions to your notes. Okay, so that's it. A little whistle-stop tour between validity and reliability. Remember, reliability is consistency. Validity is, does the test measure what the test claims to measure? And you also need to know the difference between internal and external validity. Any questions? Put them on the classroom. Okay, thanks very much, and bye.